We never should have gone out that far. Space, for all its wonder and beauty, is not meant for humans. We weren't ready. We'll never be ready. But funding had come through, and with it, the pressure to find something groundbreaking. That's why we left Earth, 5 of us crammed into a metal shell, hurtling through the void on a mission no one really understood. Our destination was an uncharted zone, a region of space beyond the Kuiper Belt that emitted strange electromagnetic pulses. Nothing about it made sense. The readings suggested something alive, or maybe intelligent. Of course, we told ourselves it was probably a natural phenomenon, a stellar anomaly. But deep down, we were all hoping to find something, the first undeniable sign that we weren't alone. It started quietly enough. The journey itself was uneventful, a monotonous crawl through the cold, black void. Days blurred into nights, though those distinctions didn't mean much anymore. Out there, time felt meaningless. We passed the hours talking about Earth, our families, and the things we missed. But as we neared our destination, the air in the cabin seemed to shift. Maybe it was just nerves. Or maybe it wasn't. I remember the moment it changed. We were still a few days out when the instruments began acting up. The readings became erratic. First small fluctuations, then outright chaos. At first, our pilot, Anders, thought it was a calibration issue, but no amount of adjustments made a difference. The pulses grew stronger, more frequent, and with them came a sound. Faint at first, like static over a broken radio, but it wasn't just a static. There was something in it, a pattern. We couldn't quite make it out, but it felt deliberate, like someone was trying to talk to us. "It's probably just interference," Anders muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. We all heard the doubt in his tone. By the time we reached the coordinates, the noise had grown louder, filling the cabin with its strange, almost musical hum. I tried to focus on my work, but it was impossible to ignore. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it, feel it reverberating in my skull. None of us were sleeping much by then. The source of the signal wasn't visible at first. There was nothing out there but empty space, a vast, indifferent blackness that seemed to stretch forever. But as we got closer, the instruments began to pick up something. At first, it was just a faint outline, a blur on the monitors. Then, slowly, it came into focus. It wasn't a planet. It wasn't an asteroid. It was something else. A structure, massive and ancient, hanging in the void like a forgotten relic. Its surface was dark and uneven, covered in jagged spires and strange flowing patterns that seemed to shift when you looked at them too long. None of us could look away. "It's artificial," murmured Dr. Keller, our lead scientist. Her voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might wake it up. "This changes everything." We approached cautiously, our ship dwarfed by the sheer scale of the thing. It didn't move, didn't emit any heat or light, but the signal was definitely coming from within. And that's when the real arguments began. Keller wanted to go inside, to explore, to make first contact if possible. Anders thought it was too dangerous. "We don't know what's in there," he said, his voice tight with unease. "We shouldn't even be here." But in the end, curiosity won. It always does. The entrance was a jagged opening near the base of the structure, large enough for us to maneuver through in our suits. The walls inside were wrong. Not like anything we'd ever seen. They weren't metal, but they weren't stone either. They pulsed faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if the entire place was alive. We moved carefully, our flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. The air was heavy, thick with a scent I couldn't place, sharp and metallic, yet somehow sweet. It didn't take long to find the source of the signal. At the center of the structure was a chamber, vast and empty except for it, a sphere suspended in midair, glowing faintly with a cold, blue light. It was beautiful, mesmerizing, and utterly alien. As we stepped closer, the sound returned, louder than ever. It wasn't just in my ears anymore. I could feel it, vibrating through my entire body. Keller reached out, her hand trembling, and the light changed. It wasn't a sudden shift, but a slow, deliberate transformation, as if the sphere was responding. The blue glow deepened, shifting into a pulsating rhythm, each wave of light more intense than the last. The hum that had been faint grew louder, piercing. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't just external, it was inside us, inside me. And then, Keller froze. Her hand hovered inches from the sphere, and for a moment, I thought she'd touched it. But no, she was just standing there, motionless, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. The rest of us shouted her name, but she didn't respond. It was like she was elsewhere. Anders grabbed her shoulder, trying to pull her back, and that's when it happened. The sphere flared, a blinding flash of light that swallowed everything. I felt weightless, like I was falling, even though I was standing still. The world around me dissolved into nothingness, and for a moment there was only the light, cold, endless, and all-consuming. When the light faded, we were no longer in the chamber. At least, it didn't look like the chamber. The walls were the same, pulsing, alive, but the space had expanded. It felt infinite, stretching beyond what should have been possible. And the air, it was heavier now, oppressive, like it was pressing down on us. Keller was still frozen, but her eyes had changed. They weren't human anymore. "We need to leave," Anders said, his voice shaking. He was right. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from that place as possible. But something held me there. Not fear, exactly, but a pull. Like the structure didn't want us to leave. "It's showing us something," Keller finally whispered. Her voice didn't sound like hers anymore. It was layered, as if something else was speaking through her. "This isn't an artifact. It's alive." Her words sent a chill through me, colder than anything I'd ever felt. I didn't want to believe her, but deep down, I knew she was right. The sphere wasn't just a machine. It wasn't a relic. It was a presence, ancient and vast, and we had woken it up. We should have turned back then, but we didn't. Keller wouldn't let us. She insisted we stay, that we try to understand. "It wants to communicate," she said. "We can't just leave. This is the discovery of a lifetime." But her voice, it wasn't hers anymore. It carried an edge, a sharpness that made my skin crawl. Against my better judgment, we followed her deeper into the structure. The corridors seemed to twist and shift as we moved, as if the place was rearranging itself around us. Every step felt heavier than the last, like we were walking through thick mud. The hum was constant now, a low, resonant thrum that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. The walls became more intricate the further we went, covered in symbols and patterns that glowed faintly in the dark. They weren't like any language I'd ever seen, but they felt familiar in a way I couldn't explain. It was like the meaning was just out of reach, brushing against the edges of my mind. Anders tried to take a photo, but the images came out distorted, the symbols blurred and shifting as if they didn't want to be captured. We came to another chamber, smaller than the first, but just as unsettling. In the center was another sphere, larger this time, and surrounded by what looked like tendrils, long, sinewy appendages that pulsed with the same faint glow as the walls. Keller approached it without hesitation, her movements unnaturally fluid, almost graceful. She reached out again, and this time, I didn't stop her. When her fingers made contact, the tendrils came alive. They wrapped around her arm, not aggressively but with a deliberate, almost tender motion. The glow intensified, filling the room with a cold, blue light that seemed to seep into my skin. And then I heard it. Not with my ears. It was inside my head, a voice or maybe a presence. It spoke in feelings, in impressions, but the meaning was clear. It wasn't welcoming us, it was studying us, peeling back the layers of who we were, digging into our minds, our memories. I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I'd never experienced before. It knew us in a way no one else ever could. Anders screamed. He clutched his head, falling to his knees as blood dripped from his nose. "Make it stop!" he shouted, his voice cracking with pain. I wanted to help him, but I couldn't move. None of us could. We were frozen, held in place by something we couldn't see, couldn't fight. Keller turned to us, her face serene, almost blissful. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice echoing strangely. The moment she spoke, something inside me twisted. Her words felt wrong, not just in what she said, but in how she said it. They weren't hers. It was as if her mouth was just a vessel, a conduit for something far beyond comprehension. Keller smiled, but it wasn't a human smile. It stretched too wide, too unnatural, and her eyes, they glimmered with that same cold blue light as the sphere. Anders was convulsing now, his screams tapering off into ragged gasps. His body writhed like he was trying to escape his own skin. The tendrils around Keller pulsed brighter, and I swear I saw them shift, stretching toward us, hungry. "I can hear them," she said softly. Her voice was layered, like multiple people speaking in unison, each tone hollow and cold. "They're trying to help us understand." Understand? No, this wasn't understanding. This was invasion. It was desecration. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just probing us. It was rewriting us, tearing apart the boundaries of what made us, us. "We need to get her out of here," I managed to choke out, though my voice felt distant, like I wasn't entirely in control of it. My legs felt like lead, but I forced them to move. Anders wasn't moving anymore, his body unnaturally still, but I didn't have time to think about what that meant. I grabbed Keller's arm, trying to pull her away from the sphere. Her head snapped toward me, too fast, like a puppet on strings. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I saw something. An expanse of stars, infinite and cold, stretching into an eternity I couldn't comprehend. It wasn't Keller staring back at me. It was something else, something vast and unfeeling. "You can't stop it," she said, her voice devoid of any humanity. "You were brought here for a reason. It's already begun." The tendrils writhed, breaking free from the sphere and lashing toward me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest as I fumbled for something, anything, to defend myself. My flashlight slipped from my grip, its beam spinning wildly across the room, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance and shift on their own. Keller stepped closer, the tendrils trailing behind her like an extension of her own body. The others tried to move, but it was as if the air itself had turned solid, trapping us in place. I could feel it now, the presence that had been lurking just out of reach. It wasn't just in Keller, it was in the walls, in the floor, in the very air around us. It was the structure, and it was alive. "Run!" I shouted, though I wasn't sure if anyone else could hear me. My voice felt swallowed by the oppressive weight of the room. Somehow, I managed to push through the invisible force holding me down, stumbling toward the exit. Keller's laughter followed me, echoing through the chamber like 1,000 voices all speaking at once. "You can't escape," she called after me. "There's nowhere to go." The others were moving now, their faces pale and eyes wide with terror. Anders was still on the ground, his body motionless, his face twisted into an expression of pure agony. We didn't have time to check if he was alive. Every instinct screamed at me to leave him, to save myself. And that's what I did. We fled the chamber, the walls seeming to close in around us as we ran. The corridors twisted and shifted, the once familiar paths now a labyrinth of pulsating, alien material. The hum was louder now, resonating through my entire body, each step feeling heavier than the last. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was a presence, a weight pressing down on us, pushing us deeper into the structure. "This way," someone shouted. "Reyes, maybe," but I couldn't be sure. The voices were blending together, everything a blur of panic and adrenaline. We turned corner after corner, but every path seemed to lead us back to the same place. The walls pulsed brighter with each passing moment, the symbols glowing with an intensity that burned into my vision. Then, suddenly, we weren't alone. The moment Keller spoke, the chamber itself seemed to respond. The tendrils around her pulsed brighter, their movements synchronized with the hum that had settled deep into my chest. Anders was still writhing on the ground, his screams reduced to wet, guttural gasps. Reyes and I stood frozen, unable or unwilling to move closer. But Keller was calm. Too calm. Her head tilted slightly, her eyes glowing faintly with that same cold blue light. "It's not just showing us," she said. "It's making us part of it." Her words sent a jolt of fear through me. There was no emotion in her voice, no urgency, no humanity. It was as if she were reciting something she'd been programmed to say. I glanced at Reyes, whose expression mirrored my own terror and disbelief. "We have to get her out of here," I whispered, my voice trembling. But deep down, I knew it was already too late. As if on cue, the tendrils began to extend, snaking through the air toward us. Their movement was slow, deliberate, almost curious. I forced myself to step back, my boots scraping against the pulsating floor. Reyes grabbed my arm, his grip so tight it hurt. "We're leaving. Now," he said through clenched teeth, his voice shaking. He glanced down at Anders, who was no longer moving. "If we stay, we're dead." But Keller wasn't listening. She stepped closer to the sphere, the tendrils wrapping around her arms like living chains. Her lips moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear. Or maybe I could hear them, but only in the part of my mind that I didn't want to acknowledge. And then the light flared again. This time, it wasn't just a flash. It was a wave, rippling through the air, through us. My knees buckled, and I hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of me. My vision blurred, the edges of the room dissolving into a swirling haze of blue and black. I could hear Reyes shouting something, but his voice was distant, distorted. The hum had grown louder, a deafening resonance that filled every corner of my mind. I looked up, and for a moment I saw something. Shapes, vast and incomprehensible, moving in the light. They weren't like anything I'd ever seen, abstract and fluid, shifting through forms that defied logic. But they were aware of us. I could feel their attention, their focus. It was like being under a microscope, every thought, every memory laid bare. And then, as quickly as it began, it stopped. The light dimmed, the tendrils retracted, and the hum subsided to a low, almost soothing pulse. The room returned to its previous state, as if nothing had happened. Keller turned to us, her expression eerily serene. "It's trying to understand," she said, her voice soft but steady. "We have to let it." "Let it?" Reyes snapped, his voice breaking. "Are you out of your mind? This thing is killing us." Keller didn't respond. She turned back to the sphere, her movements deliberate and graceful, as though she were in a trance. Anders still lay motionless on the ground, his face pale and contorted. I wanted to check if he was breathing, but my legs wouldn't move. The fear had rooted me in place. "We can't stay here," I said finally, forcing the words out. "If we don't leave now, we won't make it back." Reyes nodded, his face grim. Together, we grabbed Keller, pulling her away from the sphere. She didn't resist, but her eyes remained fixed on it, her lips still moving silently. The tendrils twitched, as if considering whether to follow us, but they stayed where they were. We half-carried, half-dragged Keller back through the twisting corridors, the pulsing walls seeming to close in around us. The structure felt different now, more alive, more aware. Every step was heavier, the air thicker, as if the place itself was resisting our escape. Finally, we reached the entrance. The jagged opening was still there, but beyond it was only darkness. The stars, the distant light of our ship, everything was gone. It was as if the structure had swallowed us whole, cutting us off from the rest of the universe. "What the hell?" Reyes muttered, his voice barely audible. "Where's the ship?" I didn't have an answer. My mind raced, searching for any explanation, but nothing made sense. The sphere, the light, the tendrils. None of it was supposed to be possible. And yet, here we were. Behind us, the hum grew louder again, the vibrations crawling up my spine. I turned, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement in the shadows. Something was coming. Something vast and unknowable. "We can't stay here," I said again, my voice shaking. "We have to keep moving." But there was nowhere to go. The silence that followed Keller's words was unbearable. A void filled only by the faint hum that seemed to grow louder in the absence of anything else. Reyes was the first to break free from the invisible grip that held us. He stumbled backward, his breath ragged, his wide eyes darting between Keller and the sphere. "This isn't right," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We need to get out of here. Now." I wanted to agree, to scream, to move, but my body betrayed me. The air felt like it was thickening again, pressing down on my chest, making every breath harder than the last. And then the tendrils around Keller moved. Slowly at first, they unwound themselves from her arm and began to extend outward, reaching toward us. Keller didn't resist. She simply stood there, watching as if mesmerized. Her eyes, still glowing faintly, locked onto mine. "It's not trying to hurt us," she said, but the voice wasn't entirely hers. It was layered, hollow, and resonant, like multiple voices speaking in unison. "It's trying to understand." Reyes didn't wait to hear more. He turned and bolted for the entrance, his footsteps echoing in the chamber. Anders was still crumpled on the ground, his breathing shallow and labored. I knelt beside him, shaking his shoulder. "Anders, we need to go." My voice cracked as I spoke, panic clawing its way up my throat. He didn't respond. His face was pale, his eyes glassy, staring up at something I couldn't see. And then I realized he was mumbling, soft, incoherent words that seemed to loop endlessly. I leaned closer, straining to hear. "It's watching. It's inside. It's waiting." A shiver ran through me, colder than the void outside. I grabbed his arm, hauling him upright as best I could. His body was limp, his weight almost too much to bear, but I couldn't leave him there. I wouldn't. Keller hadn't moved. She remained rooted in place, her gaze fixed on the sphere, as if she were part of it now. "Leave her!" Reyes shouted from the corridor, his voice echoing back to us. "She's gone. We can't save her." I hesitated. Everything in me screamed to stay, to drag her away from that thing. But deep down, I knew Reyes was right. Whatever had hold of Keller, it wasn't going to let go. Not now. Maybe not ever. The hum rose in pitch, becoming almost deafening. The walls began to pulse faster, the tendrils twitching as if alive with energy. It felt like the entire structure was waking up, its focus shifting fully onto us. The air was suffocating, vibrating with a pressure that seemed to crush my thoughts into static. I grabbed Anders tighter and stumbled toward the corridor. My legs felt like lead, every step an agonizing effort. The hum grew louder with each passing second, a crescendo that seemed to drill into my skull. As we reached the corridor, I risked one last glance back. Keller was still standing there, her face serene, her body bathed in the sphere's cold light. The tendrils wrapped around her once more, pulling her closer to the glowing core. She didn't resist. She didn't scream. She simply smiled. And then the sphere pulsed one last time. The light flared, blinding and overwhelming, forcing me to look away. When it faded, Keller was gone. The corridors were a maze now, twisting and shifting as if the structure itself were alive and determined to keep us there. Reyes was ahead, his flashlight casting frantic beams across the pulsating walls. Anders mumbled incoherently, his weight slowing me down. The hum was everywhere, surrounding us, filling every crevice of my mind. "We're not going to make it," Reyes muttered, his voice shaking. "It's playing with us. It's..." A shadow moved ahead of him, cutting him off mid-sentence. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could recognize. The shape was fluid, amorphous, its edges shifting like smoke but darker, denser. It moved with purpose, gliding through the corridor with an unnatural grace. Reyes froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Do you see that?" he whispered. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if he could see me. The shadow didn't seem to notice us. Yet. But the hum grew louder, almost as if it were guiding it toward us. I pulled Anders closer, trying to make myself as small and silent as possible. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it would give us away. The shadow stopped, its form coalescing into something almost humanoid. Almost. Its head, or what I assumed was its head, tilted slightly as if listening, and then it turned, moving toward us with impossible speed. "Run!" Reyes shouted, his voice breaking the spell of terror that had frozen me. I didn't think, I just moved. Dragging Anders behind me, I stumbled after Reyes, my breath ragged and burning in my throat. The walls seemed to close in, the corridor narrowing, twisting, turning. The shadow was right behind us. I could feel it, a cold, oppressive presence that seemed to sap the strength from my legs. And then, suddenly, we were there. The entrance. The jagged opening loomed ahead, a sliver of salvation in the suffocating darkness. Reyes reached it first, practically throwing himself through. I followed, dragging Anders behind me with every ounce of strength I had left. We collapsed onto the surface outside, gasping for air that felt no less heavy. The hum was quieter here, but it hadn't disappeared. It was inside us now, a part of us, like a parasite burrowed deep into our minds. When I looked back at the structure, the entrance was gone. The smooth, dark surface was unbroken, as if it had never been there, as if we had never been inside. Reyes sat a few feet away, his head in his hands. Anders lay motionless beside me, his breathing shallow but steady. I couldn't bring myself to speak. There was nothing to say. And then the stars blinked out. One by one, the distant lights of the galaxy disappeared, swallowed by an encroaching darkness that spread like ink across the void. It wasn't just the structure, it was everything. The vast, infinite blackness we thought we understood was coming alive, folding in on us, erasing us. I understood then. We hadn't discovered it. It had discovered us, and it wasn't going to let us go.